Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. Over the course of the last few years, I have had a lot of people asking about phonics programs. So these next two episodes, I'm featuring my two favorite phonics programs. One lends itself a little more towards homeschooling, and the other one lends itself a little more towards classrooms. However, both can be used for either a homeschool or a classroom. And so, my goal in both of these episodes is to feature the strengths of each program to help you make the right decision for either your homeschool or for your classroom. And so, be sure to listen to both episodes. And I'm sure you're going to walk away feeling a lot more confident about which program is right for you. Well, today I am delighted to introduce you to a new friend and an old friend. Rhonda Bedee and Niki Wise are with me today. And Rhonda and I go way back. She was my trainer for Spell to Write and Read when I was homeschooling my children and looking for a phonics program. And I did a lot of research on what phonics program I wanted to use, and I landed on Spell to Write and Read. Went to the training in Fort Worth, and Rhonda is oh, she's just a jewel. And I'm delighted to introduce her and Niki to you today. And we're going to get into the nitty gritties of phonics. I've been promising my followers for 2 years we were going to do phonics. We're going to do phonics today. And Rhonda is going to start off by telling us about herself a little bit, her background with Spell to Write and Read and phonics, and even with her own schooling experiences with phonics. And then we'll have Niki introduce herself, and then we'll get into the details of phonics. So, Rhonda and Niki, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm Rhonda Bedee. I like to tell children my last name is like the letters B and D, saying the names of the letters B and D. Um, and I was like you, I went looking for what is a good way to start teaching my children to read and spell. Spelling came easy to me. I don't know why. But I can remember being pregnant and having two young children at home, roaming through the lines in my first homeschool convention and thinking, what were all those elementary ed majors doing at the college I went to when they were learning how do you start teaching reading? How do you start learning to teach math? And I came across a sign that said the writing road to reading. Sounded really good. And that's where I jumped in. I ended up being trained by Wanda Sanseri for her methods of teaching spell to write and read, which had a different name at the time. And I taught my children several years, and I thought, if I had one of those, those old-timey overhead projector machines and those transparencies, that sounds so old now. But if I had that, I said, I think I could help other people learn how to do this. I thought, well, maybe one day when I'm done homeschooling, that was like 20 years later, God had a different plan. And I ended up sort of falling backwards into it and trained in Texas and surrounding states and had a wonderful time teaching you, Adrian. And Niki is a jewel because partly because she has that fantastic connections to classical education, and I had the privilege of helping train her. So I started training other teachers almost 25 years ago and have never looked back. I realized when I would recommend curriculum to other people for science, for math, I'd say, well, if your family is like this, try this curriculum. If your family is like such and such, try that curriculum. But I realized that no matter what, when people asked me anything language arts related, I could not say anything else except spell to write and read.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized I'm sticking with this. It works for me. It works for other people. And I just couldn't do anything else, and even now, I cannot imagine teaching teachers, homeschool teachers, classroom teachers, adult literacy teachers. I couldn't imagine teaching anybody else any other way than starting with the building blocks of English and building it into, believe it or not, something that can use logic for kids to be able to become lifelong readers and spellers through handwriting.
I love it. I love it. We're going to come back because I want you to tell a little bit about Wanda Sanseri and how she came to develop the program. But Nikki, could you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Niki Wise. I live in South Georgia. I've been here for a long time, so maybe I now have that Southern drawl. Um, I started out homeschooling in the 90s, and I tried all kinds of different programs looking for the right thing. We tried a lot of mainline reading and spelling, and we could spell the same words at the beginning of the week and still get them wrong at the end of the week. And so we were outside with sticks, drawing it in the dirt and doing the pudding plates and all kinds of things. And so I was on the hunt, always looking for something. And my friend Karina Tree said, "I'm going to host this, uh, training." And at the time, it was teaching reading at home in school. And she said, "Would you like to go?" And I was like, "I don't know." And she said, "Just try it." So I went, met Carolyn and Rhonda, and on the last day, my son was sixth grade, and I said, "Would you like to try this?" I needed him to buy into it, and he said, "Okay, Mom, we'll try." And at the time, I had two that I was homeschooling, and I had actually had three boys at the time. So we started out our journey with Spell to Write and Read with that. Continued, I used it for enrichment classes, teaching other families, and just because I loved it so much, I wanted them to love it. So I did some tutoring with it. I actually had an opportunity to go to South America, to Suriname, and there was a school there that was going to use Spell to Write and Read. So I was able to take the books down there and teach them and train them in the way of doing it. And that's all, it was unofficial because I wasn't a trainer. They just wanted somebody to show them what to do. And then, fast forward, I'm in Georgia, I'm in Albany, Georgia, and I get a call from Rhonda. She said, "Have you ever thought about being a trainer?" And so that started the journey of just praying that through and believing in it and saying, "I want to do this. I want to help others." So I said yes, and I've been doing the training, some in person and some Zoom, and I have loved it. And I've been able to introduce it into schools and train teachers that way. In fact, the last one I did last summer, there were 6 schools represented across the United States that all are using that. So it's on the rise.
Oh, that's wonderful. Great. Well, Rhonda, I know one of the things we wanted to get into was I would like to hear a little bit about the history of Spell to Write and Read, how I know it came out of Ramada Spalding. I know you can tell the story, and then get into a little bit of what is unique about Spell to Write and Read.
Wanda Sanseri went to college in North Carolina, and she has this most wonderful drawl that she, even after decades of living on the West Coast, she has not lost. And I love to hear her tell her stories. How she was a high school English teacher in a very poor school, and so she was teaching Shakespeare, other things, but she realized she was teaching a class of students who could hardly write their names and couldn't spell much of anything. And she realized she didn't know what to do. Another teacher said, "Well, you need to teach them some of the basics, like A is for apple." She said, "I was 22 years old and did not know what this woman meant." She had never heard that principle. It came to a head when she and her husband spent 6 months in Korea several years later. She had to be trained, the basics of Korean. And her first instructor would show Korean symbols and teach the sound for it. And it worked so well for her that she said she could walk downtown, pass by McDonald's, look at the Korean letters and realize, oh, hamburger. She could sound it out based on what she'd learned and realized, oh, it's a hamburger.
Mm-hmm.
Then that teacher was taken away. Another teacher came in who changed the focus. And she said it was never as clear. They ended up coming back to the States, And she thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody would teach English that way? It would help so much. She had 3 little boys. Her husband died of a brain tumor. So here she was, a brand new widow, but she hoped to be able to read. Someone came and paid for her, provided childcare for her to go to hear and be trained with Romalda Spalding, teaching her seminars for how to teach in the classroom with the Writing Road to Reading. It was a week-long class, long days for her. It was wonderful, and she learned so much. Later, she took a second class for college level credit with Miss Spalding, and she had a few ideas that had come about with working with her sons. And she even showed some of those ideas to Romalda Spalding, who said, that's a good idea. So she felt pretty comfortable with that. She did train with an extension of that method for a while, but that did not go well. And she ended up just saying, "I'm just going to homeschool my boys." She married, moved to Oregon, and really jumped into homeschooling. And so after a while, people started asking her, what is it that you're doing with your boys? They're so good with language arts. So she put together a 15-page hand typed note, a stapled piece of paper to help people get started. And that was the basis where she eventually wrote Teaching Reading at Home. So it really helped homeschoolers because the when she learned from Romalda Spalding, it was all focused on classroom, classroom, classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And she made it this way. And people said, "Will you show us how to do this?" That turned into some small classes. It turned into a book. Schools started using it. It expanded to teaching reading at home and school. And then eventually she refined it. She made some changes that were good. Most people thought that Romalda Spalding's methods could not be improved on. Wanda Sanseri did. I've compared it and I've realized, yes, it was an improvement. And she changed the name to Spell to Write and Read, SWR. And the whole idea is it's teaching phonics and reading through handwriting with a huge focus up front on spelling. Most people separate those. When I
Mm-hmm.
was in public school, I had a spelling book, I had reading books, and we had penmanship books. It was all separated.
Mm-hmm.
This integrates it. The children have better brain retention. And so that has just grown. She's done this for 4 decades and then has just recently handed over the publishing part, printing and distribution, to one of our trainers, and who has started an independent website called SWR Forum. And that is our huge resource. But that is in a nutshell, what happened. But it really came to a focus when she had to learn another language. And the whole point was, how do you teach language?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where she launched from.
I love how you described it as teaching. How did you say it? Teaching reading through handwriting.
Yeah, teaching reading with spelling through handwriting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to talk camp on that. Maybe even Nikki, you could speak into this as well. Tell us how the handwriting helps them learn how to read.
I would like to say something,
Yeah.
but before but yeah, you can expand, Nikki.
Yeah.
The recent advances with MRI has shown that what goes on in the brain when people are learning. And the standard recommendation currently for college students is when you take notes in class, don't type on your laptop.
Mm.
Handwrite your notes. Why? Because MRIs have now shown that that's the way the brain retains. So we're saying let's do that with children from the very beginning. The kinesthetic movement of the brain hearing sounds from the ear, sending the signal down the arm to the hand for the child to know what symbol, what code to write on paper for the sounds that he or she hears.
Mm-hmm.
And it's proven scientifically.
That's a
Yeah, I love that.
competition.
One of the things that I found to be intriguing too is when I first bought Spell to Write and Read, everything was the program was manuscript handwriting, printing, learning through printing. There was an option through another trainer that we could buy a program called Cursive First, and it would go along with Spell if you wanted. But
Mhm.
now I understand that recently Spell to Write and Read has adopted cursive as the way students are actually learning the program from the beginning. You're not doing the manuscript handwriting anymore. You're doing
It
cursive now. Is that correct?
it's still an option. We're not insisting on
Okay.
cursive being the first, but we see so many brain advantages. When a child learns how to write cursive, associating those letters with sounds, he doesn't lift his pencil
Mhm.
writing most of a word or all of a word, except for, crossing the T. And it's more cohesive,
Mhm.
and it's the activity of connecting. I think it's like both sides of the brain, and it just
Yes.
has longer retention. Okay,
Okay,
Nick.
so if somebody wanted to buy it, they can choose either or, but your recommendation is more to really consider the cursive first. And one of
Yeah.
the arguments that I've heard with that is, well, if my child is learning cursive first and they're seeing the phonogram cards in print and reading is in print, doesn't that get them confused? So what's your experience in that?
That's such a great question. Can I just tag in
Yeah.
just a little bit about that too? Because, I asked Wanda about the cursive back early on. Um, and she did say, that that was an option, the manuscript versus the cursive. But she said the more research I did, and she was even, I think, in Georgia during a seminar, and she said the more research I did, the more I became convinced that cursive was a better way to go because of that uniform thinking, because of the looking at a word as a single unit instead of picking it up and change, picking your pen or pencil up and having to change that thought. Some of the students who are struggling with that learning challenge of dyslexia and things, there's um, less tendency to reverse letters because they're staying in that
Mhm.
uniform way and keeping their pen or pencil to the paper. And when you think about it, I know we're on a podcast, but when you think about it, there's no other skill that you use when you're holding your pencil correctly that puts that right and left finger like that and connects your brain, the left and right hemisphere. There's no other skill that we do that's like that. So it's a very powerful way of connecting the brain that way.
Mhm. Mhm. And you have not experienced children having a problem transitioning from writing in cursive to reading the word in print?
I didn't because we did it all. I
Aha.
would I would show the phonogram cards, and which is what we call book face. It
Okay.
the way most children's books are written, so the letter A and the letter G tend to look a little different. It's what we would call now with, type fonts, like the Times Roman with
Mm.
the A and G, which is an old printing press problem that happened 500-600 years ago. But what I've noticed is that as long as a child does not have a an, a visual problem where their eyes are not seeing the letters correctly, they can learn book face, they can learn cursive, and they write in cursive and learn printing, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. And that happened with my third child, who was my first that I decided to teach cursive when he was 5 years old, starting with cursive. But sometimes I was so used to doing printing, I would get up and I would start printing with him. And I always showed him the book face letters with the phonogram cards. It didn't ever seem to be a problem for him because he didn't have any visual problems. He didn't have any auditory issues.
Mhm.
And he learned it all, and it was not hard.
Mhm. Well, and my understanding is that if a child gets diagnosed with dyslexia, they have found that cursive is what they should be doing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, they do recommend that. Dyslexia, dysgraphia, those are both, a recommendation is to implement cursive. And just in all the years that I've used SWR and the tutoring and then those kind of things, I've never had a student that doesn't have any, processing challenges struggle with making that print to cursive, writing in cursive, reading in print. They just haven't had that challenge before them. And I know that's been a concern for some homeschoolers, even when they've
Mhm.
thought about that.
Mhm. Nikki, would I know you work with schools, and do most of the schools choose the cursive first, or is there like a divide on that?
The ones that I have been in, they use cursive. They use cursive. In fact, being on the side as I was of the curriculum coordinator for the last school that I came from, it was easy to recommend cursive first and to implement it because it complemented already what we were learning and spelled right and read, and that integration was really strategic for the students and their learning, and we felt like it was a, a very, cursive first as far as that one. It was easy to implement and to put with spelled right and read.
Mhm, mhm.
So,
And when you're bringing this into schools, I'm curious, what are the reactions of the teachers that are switching to this with cursive and parents? Are they a little nervous?
you know what? The cursive is not as much of a challenge as it is when you're using, if you're using a mainline phonics program that uses blends or sight words or this look say or the whole language, that's usually where some of the challenges. It's not so much in the cursive versus print, but it is in the approach of these other ones. So
Okay. Okay. Wanda, can you lead us down a little bit about some of the unique differences for that Spelt and Write and Read has compared to some other programs? And I know that you know sort of the history of phonics, if you want to walk us through some of that as well.
I I used to think that a lot of this road that I followed and Nikki has followed and you followed, it started around 1915 with the publication of the Ayres list, the 1,000 most common words in English. And I know that around the same time, I think in the 1910s, 1920s, John Dewey was changing the course of public schools in America. And it really took off, I think, mostly in the 40s, and then in the 1950s, there was a revolt among lots of Americans. We need to go back to basics. Well, when they did, it came out to the Dick and Jane readers, which is just repetition, 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 because somebody interpreted drill as being that way. But those books were awful. They were terribly boring. Now, some people feel sentimental in their remembrances of them, but that's because they were children and that's what they had. But when you look at the stories themselves, they're not stories. They're built. Well, I found out I was wrong. I feel like that a lot of our phonics issues goes back to the mid 1800s, and believe it or not, is with Alexander Graham Bell. He was working with deaf students and probably one of the first deaf schools, looking for anything and everything he could to help deaf students. And in doing so, they did find some really good methods to help deaf students at that time. But when people said, this has worked so well for the deaf students, let's try it with non deaf students. And they did, but it failed miserably. So everybody went back to the phonics and the spelling and the basics of reading that had been done in America since the early hornbook days, but then they went back to that. But what I've noticed is that over time, since around the mid 1800s, every time that people said, there's a problem with that, maybe they don't like the basics of phonics, maybe they thought it was too boring or it's not exciting enough, the pendulum would swing and people would try new methods, some progressive methods, whatever. But then people would realize, no, that's not working. And they'd swing back to strong phonics and spelling as the basis for reading. But then somebody would come in, let's try something else. And it was like, it just, this pendulum swing went on it's gone on for 150 years. But it seems to me that every time the pendulum would swing back to strong phonics and emphasis on spelling, it's like people would lose a little bit each time. And so you get to mid-century, 20th century, people, they revolted and it's like, what do you do? Well, then in the 60s, you have the private schools, let's do something, let's take it away from the public schools because it's like we're not getting anywhere. And then the 70s, many, many Christian schools. And Nikki, when would you say classical schools took hold as a modern movement? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think the mid to upper 80s is when Douglas Wilson started coming out.
Mhm.
We got, Dorothy Sayers' essay came out, and people were gravitating to that. And then, of course, the bell cow Logos school kind of started going. And so it really did take off from there. So it's still pretty young here in our country, but that's kind of when I think that the US movement really took off with classical.
Mhm.
Thank you. So, for being unique, it's saying we're going to start with sound. That's the first thing a child hears is sound,
Mm.
and then help a child know how to write that sound as code, black marks on white paper.
Yep.
And you do it step by step, little bit by little bit, where the children hear the sounds. They learn kinesthetically to write that sound. They say it as they're writing. And then after they've written a short word, whatever, then they have it visually. Wanda Sanseri likes to say it's sight last. Then they look at the word and then they read it. They have the children and their teachers and their moms and their dads have helped them phonetically rip words apart, glued them back together, figured out how to write it, what to do with it, how to sound it out, which phonogram spellings are going to be used because English has influence of over 28 languages that have influenced the spelling, and that's why we have such seemingly weird combinations of letters. Figuring that out, and it's experienced one word at a time, but those words all start with sounds. So Wanda Sanseri says that SWR methods are sound to symbol, and
Mm.
that is vital. And then the kinesthetic parts and auditory and visual. The children do not see a word first. When I was in first grade, second grade, my teacher would say, open your spelling book to page 20. And the first thing that I saw was a list of 20 spelling words. Boom, immediately. And they usually had something in common. They all had the same spelling pattern.
Yeah.
Well, then the children's brains, but most kids are smart. They see it and they go, oh, okay, I got it. This week, everything has an ER in it.
Yeah.
And part of their hardworking brains turns off because
Right.
we're always looking for excuses to make something easier. But with spell to write and read, when we teach our children, it's that they have to listen to the sounds. They have nothing in front of them except blank paper, and they have to listen and work through it and figure it out, sound it out. The teacher helps them step by step to figure it out. Then they write the words.
Mhm.
Then they read the words. Then they talk about, okay, why is it spelled this way? Let's analyze it. And are there any spelling rules we need to apply that are happening here? So it's one word at a time.
Mhm. Nikki, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
She did a great job. I love the classical approach for spell to write and read because it does start with that grammar, those sounds, and then they move those sounds to, the words, and there's logic in there, and you're learning why does that spell that way. So I think that's what makes it beautiful when it comes to that classical approach. And then of course they're, creating their own stories, their own words, and I think that's what's
Mhm.
fun about spell to write and read is that it is such a classical approach.
Yeah, when I did my research on all the different phonics programs that I needed to recommend when I was at the University of Dallas and we were working with schools, we my team and I we we got samples of a lot of different phonics programs. And, we ended up creating a chart of pros and cons and landed on Spell to Write and Read as the one that we wanted to recommend. And the schools that we work with bought it, loved it, went through the training, and just, it was great. Um, Transition was just fine, and they did start with cursive. Um, One of the things that I found to be quite interesting was how many phonics programs use cartoons and twaddle
Mm,
books, twaddle being like books that are kind of silly and
mhm,
not classical, and
mm,
cartoons aren't classical. And so, one of the things that was real attractive to me about Spell to Write and Read was this idea, Nikki, that you just brought up, is they're creating their own books. So can either of you walk us through what that looks like and explain to our listeners what I'm talking about?
Rhonda, go ahead, and I'll just tag in if I hear something.
Okay. Well, one of the neat options that we have on this website I mentioned earlier, swrforum.com, is that there is a template for children to make their own books. So it's just it's a two-page template, but you print it back to back on one piece of cardstock. You cut it in half, and then the children create their own books. And it can be so simple. The first list of spelling words that the children work on has words that are just enough that they could write some short sentences like top and cat, six, ran, bed, fish. Just enough words that the children could come up with their own sentences, tell a very short story, write it, illustrate it, and it's their own little book, just maybe 6 pages long, real small, just right for the size of their hands. And, it costs next to nothing to make and simple for a teacher to do. You print them out, you cut it in half, you staple it, poof, child has a book. And then the
Mhm.
child becomes the author. Well, that means the creativity and
Yes.
all the things that Nikki has been talking about. And
Yeah,
uh,
and they illustrate it too, so they're not it's blank. So they're
right,
Yeah.
not looking at cartoons, they're illustrating a cat, a hat, maybe six cats, six hats, right? And
yeah,
so, and then what I love about this, I think there's 20 words in that first list. There's plenty of words if the teacher says just choose five and write a little story. And the kids can exchange their books and read each other's books. They can take it home and read their book to their parents. And then the next week, when they get list B, they can write another book and now they have 40 words. And I absolutely think that is, to me, that's very classical. That's more than giving them a book to look at. That
Hmm.
they're actually creating a book with their words. They're owning it. Like you said, they're using their own. It's taking ownership. This is what a classical education is taking ownership
Hmm.
of your own learning. And so I think to me that was something that really stood out to me as something very different that uh, in my opinion, makes spell to write and read very much a classical approach to phonics. And the other thing that one of the reasons we couldn't recommend some of the other programs was because they have like videos that you can show the children and their cartoons again. And I'm just like, this is not, we're wanting to introduce our children to beauty. And
Yeah.
cartoons are fun, they have their own place, but in my opinion, not in school. That's
Yeah.
twaddle. We don't put twaddle in school,
Ah.
lollipops. We feed our children a full course meal in school and they can have a lollipop after school with their, but
Yeah.
in your school time, this is what Charlotte Mason says during the school hour, we read
Yes.
our best. And so the phonics curriculum also matters. It matters that it's beautiful and that you're calling from the child for them to give their best work. And if it's just a worksheet that they're tracing the letters and it's in, I know spell to write and read, you do have some supplemental worksheets that parents can buy if they need that. But overall, that's an extra. The program itself is not a list of worksheets. The children are making their own books. They're doing their own learning logs with their own reference pages to reference back to spelling rules. And I love that so much. And I think I love the fact that the teachers are writing their own as well. Rhonda, you have something to say.
yeah. One of the hugest parts is that every week and with every group of words, the children are assigned, if the teacher chooses it, and that it's pushed and pushed to write their own sentences with those words. In fact, currently SWR Forum has an original sentence contest going on with prizes. And so one of my tutoring students is entering the contest. And even though she seems to show uh, signs of some dysgraphia, her vocabulary is absolutely amazing for a seventh grader, and the sentence that she has come up with to enter in the contest just blows me away. And
Well,
it
and
was
even
all her. I did not coach her.
That's fun.
can I add just one more thought on that as far as designing your own, booklets? What's great about this is the integration of so many different things. The wonder of learning, obviously them being able to create their own stories. The other thing is you can start this in stages. If somebody doesn't have, all the motor skills, it's not to frustrate them into writing these long sentences, but they can, practice narration. They could do those oral stories to start, and that way they're practicing narration, they're practicing proper grammar, whole sentences. Those kind of things are already in there and they're already being introduced. So I think it's a great way that we see all the integration of all the language arts.
I think you're right. I definitely experienced that with my daughters when I was using the program. Can we talk a little bit about the training, like what the training looks like? I mean, when I went, I think everybody there was a homeschooler, but I know there's teacher training now because schools are using spell check and read. So maybe we could talk to both the training and I know like there's different different phonics programs have just video training. You have live training. There's other programs that have live training, and maybe there's some cost differences we could talk about as well. So if one of you guys want to start, that was a big question.
Yeah. Rhonda, you want to start?
Yeah, in fact, Adrian, that the seminars that you went to were hosted by a classical school.
Ah, yes.
So there were some teachers there. Um, the author, Wanda Sanseri, wanted to provide practical but in-depth training in the shortest amount of time possible. The trainings she had gone to with Ramonda Spalding were 5 to 10 days and at least 6 hours per day. When Wanda Sanseri started offering classes, she managed to condense it to 2 8-hour days, and they were jam packed.
Well, speaking of in depth training and 2 days of jam packed training, I want to take a quick break to invite you to our first online classical education conference. Every session will be recorded so you can come and go as you need. This conference is not only for home educators, classroom teachers, and school leaders, but also for parents. If you're a parent with a child in a classical school, or you're simply considering classical education as a viable option, please check out our conference. Featured speakers for this conference include 11 master teachers who are all on the beautiful teaching team, and collectively, we are leading 16 sessions. Teachers can earn up to 11 hours towards continuing education credit upon request. Just to give you a teaser, one session is presented by our very own reading specialist, Sarah Schrag, who will be leading a session called Phonics Instruction, The Essentials, where she will discuss the ways in which Orton and Gillingham continued the work of Charlotte Mason with a systematic multi-sensory approach to teaching children phonics. To read about all the presenters, the topics, and to see the complete conference schedule, visit my website, beautifulteaching.com. Now let's return to the conversation.
Currently, we offer a basic seminar. It's certainly not required, but we offer it as often as we can. For 30 plus years, it was all in-person seminars. Of course, when the pandemic came, things changed. But the first time I ever did an online class, that's when Nikki participated. She drove to Florida to a class to help with them. So she was there actively showing the flashcards, getting the teachers to participate, and not where Carolyn Gibbons and I were on screen, and the teachers were all in one room from two schools, two classical schools, and they were participating, but it just made such a difference, Nikki, that you were there and on campus and in the room, and because you could
Mm.
hear things that we couldn't hear. But that was even before the pandemic started. Uh, that we just didn't have any trainers that were nearby. And that was part of the impetus of asking Nikki, have you ever thought about doing this? Because it is a work of love. It's a labor of love. But we figured out how to do it. Well, in the time since, we've learned more about how to use uh, online videos as much as possible to make it as close as possible to an in-person class. That's been my goal the whole time. I've since had to stop driving. I still do in-person classes, but my husband has to drive me. Uh, but and I'm willing to go anywhere as long as I can get there. But where I'm trying to offer classes all year long. The basic seminar that my friend Carolyn offers is 3 consecutive days for about 6 hours each day through Zoom, and the cost is in hour by hour and person by person is it's comparable to some of the main phonics programs that we think are comparable to ours, similar to ours, but as when you compare it to a lot of mainline curricula that is, in our opinion, not as good. I'll just have to be real simple and say it. But the cost is, when I did a cost analysis a few years ago, it tended to be about a tenth of the cost, person per person. And usually, other programs will say, but you need more training. Now, we offer more training, but none of it is required. We just offer it because some people just need to see it modeled. They need to participate and they do that. But in general, a 2 to 3 day class, it can be online and it can be in person. We have trainers across the country who are willing to do this. But we train everybody pretty much the same. We'll do some adaptations depending on what the needs are where we go, but we start at the beginning. We talk about how do you teach young children to listen to the sounds, and then we can teach everything from preschool, teaching preschool to up to fifth, sixth grade, middle school, high school, and adults. I use the same principles, the same ideas in teaching adults for English ESL classes at my church.
Mhm.
And I still do it the same way, and I start the same way, and I progress in a lot the same way.
Mhm.
And I do basic training like Carolyn. So that 3 day stretch, mine are 2 half days and a whole, an 8 hour day in the middle of it. And there's an opportunity for me to teach, but also for them to practice being the teacher. So there's lots of ways where they dictate the spelling words and they practice on each other. With the pandemic and with Zoom being an option, and having those breakout rooms, we can still do those things if we're not in person. I have enjoyed being able to do in person,
Mhm.
and being able to have that dialogue and them answering each other's questions. But we've learned so much about how to use these online platforms to create more interactive ways for them to learn. And so that's my main thing is if I do Zoom. I had a couple, two girls, both from Africa. So their time zone was way
Right.
different than ours. When we
Mhm.
were finishing, they were midnight before they were
Yeah.
getting done. And I really had to appreciate their efforts because they wanted to get the training. And a lot of times it's being able to just answer some of the questions about how to use those two books together.
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, and there's always, I end my time, but I always give myself an extra hour if I'm doing a Zoom one. I say, if anybody wants to stick around and they have specific questions that we haven't answered, I'm happy to do that. And I have about 85 to 90% of them stick around just to ask further questions. And so it's a way to get those personal ones answered. I think that's what makes the endorsed trainers valuable to the program is that they're
Mhm.
able to do
Mhm.
so.
No.
And, like she talked about ongoing training, you can do that and you can use the forum as part of your, training as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
because there are ways for people to focus in on special things on the forum, like if they want to, if a person is a classroom teacher, she can go and click a link for what's said here for classroom teacher on the forum, and she can instantly see that. If she wants to see methods and ideas and other efforts connected to classical, there's a classical link for tying together all the details available on SWR forum for classical methods
Mhm. Mhm. And homeschool.
and homeschool.
Mhm.
Yes. And for
Because
any of them that finish, we have a certificate of completion, and some of them have used it, homeschoolers and teachers, to share with their administration or even in the state, just keeping that certification on file that they did complete this training.
Ah,
So
I see. Now, Rhonda, you mentioned something about having a limited amount of trainers around the country. Do you have more trainers now than you used to? Like, do you know how many trainers you have?
I think we currently have 17.
Oh, that's good.
We did used to have a few more, and several have retired after 25 years of training.
Wow.
And so we're hoping to find some more new trainers to fully develop so that they can train others. But I love the fact that it just works so well for both homeschoolers and classroom teachers and other types of teachers, tutors. I have a listing of private tutors on my website. They're not endorsed trainers by what Wanda Sanseri, but I know their background. I know what classes they've taken. I've listened to their conversations. I know what details they focus in on their students, and I can recommend them. And some homeschoolers will take the class and then feel like they still need some help. Maybe if they're doing homeschooling 4 or 5 days a week, but they feel like that there's maybe one aspect of SWR that they want help with, they can hire a private trainer for a 45-minute lesson once a week to
Mm.
accomplish that for them. But when it comes to cost, the 2 books, the 2 sets of flashcards, and free access to SWR Forum with a free membership is just an amazing low cost
Hmm.
and accessibility for homeschoolers to be able to give their children the best language arts training for learning English.
Right. And you don't have like the consumable workbooks that they're filling out. You have the logs. Could you explain a little bit different what the difference is between like a log and a workbook? Because I know workbooks can be really expensive and the logs are really, really affordable.
Yeah.
And they're necessary.
Nikki, do you want to talk about it? I mean, it
well,
doesn't matter to me.
I mean, either way, consumable workbooks, once you've written in those pages, you can't, you have to buy a new one for the next level. And so the cost there, is a yearly cost. With Spell to Write and Read, you buy that core kit and then you're just buying a log. Either you're buying that red log or you're buying that black log, primary log or the black learning log. And that's it, and those are really affordable. Those are, I don't even know the actual price now that they are, but that's all you're required to do in a red pencil. And I can use that red pencil 2, 3 years before I need another one.
Yeah.
So it really is affordable, especially for homeschoolers who are on a single income family. That makes a huge consideration for them.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and also the book, the teacher book, it's K through 12, right? I mean,
Yes.
Yes,
it's you buy all
Uh,
your grades in one book. So you're not
yes.
having to buy
mm,
a teacher book for first grade, a teacher book for second grade, a teacher
right.
book for third grade, it's all in one. And so how do you help schools sort of divide the grades in those, do you get where I'm at? Like with a pacing, do you have like
Yeah.
a pace? Is there a pacing guide
Yeah.
available or do you put that in the training for
Yeah.
schools? I'm curious.
Well, Ron can tell you there is a pacing thing in there, but I don't know if Wanda loves that she loves the idea that homeschoolers have that opportunity, that freedom to be
Yeah.
able to find where their child best fits.
Yes.
When we're working in a school, usually the approach is, let's start with that, what we know possibly that they need to have. We do a diagnostic that kind of helps to set the pace for that classroom. And there's been a few times when a teacher has come to me and said, okay, I did a diagnostic and they're at 2 different levels, what would you do? And so we've had to work through some of those challenges.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
But there is a simple table that gives a rough idea of what it would be like teaching anybody, whether homeschooling or classroom, from kindergarten through, say, 5th grade, 6th grade. But Wanda Sinceri really did not want to make that chart. She wanted everybody to have the flexibility, but like Nikki just said, a lot of times it's going from the known to the unknown. And so many people, homeschoolers and classroom teachers, know about 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and they can at least use it as a springboard. I wanted to throw in a little bit more about the logs.
Mhm.
The log, I always think of the old Star Trek series about Captain's Log. It's a blank book with guidelines.
mm,
most of the book is room for the children to write the words that we talked about earlier about taking each word and analyzing it phonetically and putting it in the book. But there is a section about a third long, third of the book that is um, we call reference pages, and they're blank, but they're designed with columns and some headings. And each one of those is for children to either work on the details of learning a spelling rule or collecting words that fit certain spelling rules so that the children, after they've learned the words, then they say, oh, this word fits such and such a rule that we have in English. Yeah, which is funny because some people think, oh, there's no rules in English. Well, there are, and it, like Niki said, there's logic there. It's hard to know it unless you teach it that way. But the children are the ones who are responsible for writing in, guided by
Mhm,
teachers.
mhm.
And so it's like a child once a year starts with a blank book, and through the year, he or she is writing her own spelling book. And that's
Right.
really what it's about, is making her own
Right.
book, but with guidance and not
Hmm.
all at once and not with copy work.
Mhm.
This is not about copy work. This is about question and answer, uh, student and teacher, starting with blanks and doing it one little bit at a time. The black log has all the reference pages. The primary log has 15. The black log has 39. The primary log has 15 because younger children don't need as many pages to
Hmm.
start off with. But we don't even call them first grade, second grade, third grade. It's just basically sort of the beginning one and then the full one.
Right. That makes sense. Yes, I get it.
Hmm.
And for our listeners to understand, the little book that the students create, that they illustrate, is different than the log. The log
Yeah,
is where they're collecting their spelling words. They're kind of collecting their reference words that fit under categories of spelling rules and phonograms.
right.
The little book they
Okay.
make is a
Yep.
different, it's just an extra assignment to help them practice making the connections and writing their own storybooks.
And having
Yeah, there's a
the creativity.
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of extra creative enrichment type things, and the book is one of those enrichment
Yeah,
type
exactly.
activities.
Um, do we want to talk about explicit versus implicit phonics programs? Because I know that that's a big topic, and I know classical schools are saying we want to use explicit phonics programs, and it might be helpful for our listeners to understand the difference between explicit and implicit phonics.
Okay.
Sure. So I, in my student days and then in my teaching days, never really understood anything else except explicit phonics. I just didn't know that's what it was. Explicit phonics came to focus with me when I started finding out, oh, say 2, 3 decades ago, that there were many teachers, especially for kindergarten, preschool, first grade, that would hold up a word or write a word on the board, write the full word like cat, and then would point to the letter A and say, this letter says the sound in the middle of cat. So the child has to hear the whole word, see that his teacher is pointing to this one letter in the middle, and has to figure it out without the teacher breaking it down into k, a, t, each
Mm.
sound. So the opposite is breaking a word down into the sounds. That's explicit phonics. Holding up one symbol, a letter, like letter A, and saying this letter can say these sounds. That's starting showing the symbol and giving the sounds. And we teach all the sounds that that letter can make. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's two or three or more. And that's the difference. So explicit phonics is showing a letter and saying, here are the sounds, and
Mhm.
getting the children to say those sounds. Implicit phonics is saying a word and pointing to a letter and telling the children, your brain is going to have to figure out what this sound is for this word. I'm not going to tell you.
Okay. So when you're looking at phonics programs, they could be real different. And they don't
Hmm.
necessarily say, I'm an implicit phonics program, right? So, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So, in other words, they're teaching the word cat, and in that, they're isolating the sound that the letter A makes as just the sound ah.
Yes,
Whereas explicit phonics is teaching the children that this letter A makes three sounds ah, a, ah.
that's explicit
So
phonics.
that they're learning all the sounds. And the way spell to write and read works is they're learning the sounds and the symbol before they're learning their spelling words. Before they're learning to read, they're actually drilling those sounds and learning when they see this symbol, it says a, ah, or the symbol letter e, right?
Mhm.
And so they're getting the skill of learning all of the possibilities of that symbol
Yes. And
before
having
you're
immediate recall.
immediate recall before you're giving them a word to look at. So then when
Mhm.
they see the word cat in their mind, they have to think, oh, that's a, ah. It could say it could say a, or it could say ah. And so they use that skill to sound out the word cat, starting with a because it's the most common sound, right? So they're going to get the
Right?
Mhm.
word right pretty quickly because they're going to start with a.
Yes.
Okay.
But in learning those all the sounds first, that means when children pick up a book and start reading, uh, that they'll try the first sound first, and if it doesn't sound like a word that maybe teacher has said or that they've ever heard before, try the second sound. And if that one doesn't seem to make a word, then try the third sound.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I like what Wanda Sanseri says. She calls SWR methods, I call it the Sanseri method, early, direct, systematic, intensive phonics. Early, first, and fast. We teach the code as the foundational beginning, and we're not slow about it. Direct, it's
Right.
straightforward. It's what Montessori method calls direct instruction.
Hmm.
You did, and that's explicit phonics. Systematic, it's scientifically ordered. It's not incidental. It's not haphazard. Intensive, you're going to work on this with students one or more times a day. And I love the Charlotte Mason idea of short lessons, but over the course of the day. And then phonics, sound to symbol, linking the sounds of speech to letters that represent the sounds.
Yeah.
One of the things also about spell to write and read, and there may be some other programs out there, but there's some that do not pay attention to the cyclical aspect.
Mm,
That is one thing that spell, write, and read does is it's cyclical. It brings it around each time. And every time it comes around that concept or that rule, it goes deeper and deeper into mastery. And that is one of the things that we want to do is create mastery of using these tools. It's not that spell to write and read is going to say you could spell, we're going to teach you to spell every single word. What we're going to do is give you the tools to spell any word that you need to. So this cyclical aspect where it keeps coming around the concepts or the rules to go into a long-term mastery, as opposed to having, here's a list of words that you're going to get and then you're never going to see them again, or the tools are not going to come back. We're just going to keep going through. Or there's phonetic awareness. Oh, if we see these kinds of words, eventually this child will understand them. Even there was a New York reporter that talked about how some of the school systems are showing books and asking the kids to guess based on the pictures, like you talked about cartoons earlier. Well, because culturally they might come up with different words, that doesn't help them read. It just helps them guess based on their own background.
Hmm.
So, there's a lot of different programs out there that are doing it that those kinds of approaches. But what I like about spell to write and read, it is logical, it is systematical, it is cyclical, so that it keeps coming back and creating mastery.
Hmm. It's interesting, Rhonda, too, how you brought up um, the changes that have happened, and it's good that people are realizing the whole word approach isn't working. There was an article, I think you and I spoke about it. Lucy Calkins, a leading literary expert. A lot of people,
yes,
especially classroom teachers, have probably heard of her using her curriculum in their schools. This New York Times article headline says, "In the fight over how to teach reading, this guru makes a major retreat." And
yes.
do you want to talk a little bit about what she's how she's changed her mind?
Well, yeah, and to do that, I want to back up to the major podcast that I think is the catalyst for all these changes these last few years. That it just has spread like wildfire. Put out by National Media Foundation, something like that.
It's okay. We'll put it in the show link. We'll put the link in the show notes.
And I cannot think of the two authors of that, but they talked about during the pandemic, children were coming, at home, and the schools previously had told them your child is doing fine in reading, and then parents one by one across America in all 50 states were discovering, well, no, my child is not sounding out words. That's the way I learned ages ago, and my child is not really reading. My child can only read what he's heard me read multiple times. It's really just imitation. So at the end of that podcast series of six, Lucy Calkins is mentioned, and then Phineas and Fennell, and they are the gurus
Hmm.
of the whole language in America, and because of the sweeping realization that we really need good, solid phonics across America, Lucy Calkins made the choice. She's at Columbia Teachers College. She made the choice to choose to change her curriculum with now including some good phonics with it, and recognizing the other two who live in another country chose not to change. But Lucy Calkins did. She was humble enough to recognize we need to do something different, and what we're doing is not servicing teachers and students well enough. And so I admire her because that had to have been a huge step for her to make that change. Back in the 1920s and 30s, there was a neurologist, Dr. Samuel Orton, who was pretty much the first person to uh, try to find solutions for dyslexic children. He didn't coin the term dyslexia. I used to say he did, but I was wrong. But he started looking for ways. He was joined by an Anna Gillingham, who worked with him for a time. And I can't find the specific research, but something I have heard or read in the past few decades indicated to me that Anna Gillingham took that Ayres list from 1915 of the 1,000 most common English words, broke it down into the 70 phonograms, which are all the different spelling patterns used in just those most common words,
Hmm.
and then devised spelling rules that she observed that go with those. From there, there was a woman who worked with them. I've said she was an intern. I'm not exactly sure what her position, but that was Romalda Spalding. And she saw the great success that Dr. Orton was having. Eventually, Anna Gillingham left and went on, and she worked with a woman named Bessie Stillman, and they developed teacher materials and again wanted to help students who were dyslexic. And so that's what most people call Orton Gillingham methods, or some people even call it Orton Gillingham Stillman. And those are specifically designed for remedial work with dyslexic students.
Hmm.
But then we have this other branch, the people that I've been mentioning, Dr. Orton with Romalda Spalding, who then wrote her own book. And then from her, we have the outgrowth of Wanda Sanseri with Spell to Write and Read. And so I call that the Orton Spalding branch.
Oh,
And
interesting. Yeah.
now we call it, I say that we have the Sanseri method. Orton Gillingham is remedial. It comes when children are a little older, and it is to help specifically to help dyslexic children. A lot of people really get on the bandwagon because it seems like it has a lot of good ideas, and I'm not going to say it doesn't. But the way that Romalda Spalding and then Wanda Sanseri developed it, it is for all children, starting with the foundation, so that most children never reach the difficulties that are associated with dyslexia because their eyes are trained well in the direction we read and write. They learn the spelling phonograms well. They're not rushed into reading. And it's for all students of all levels, all grades, all ages.
I'm going to ask my closing question. You can choose one of two. Um, what is a quote from a book that has had a huge
Mm.
impact on you? Or what book do you wish you had read sooner in your life?
The classic Bible teacher, whose name I can't remember, said something to the effect of, God put the wiggle in children. Don't you dare try to take it out. I needed that, especially when my children were little. And yes, I was starting with spell to write and read because I am a language arts girl. I am a worksheets girl. I am let's sit at the chair with our feet flat on the floor and obey everything the teacher says and have lots of fun doing it because this is what I enjoy type of teacher. And then I had Stephen. And I had to learn that kinesthetic work and
Mm.
activity is what our children need and that they learn better and that yes they need discipline, they need to do those things, but they also need those opportunities for their bodies to just be the bodies that God made them
To
Yeah.
wiggle.
at the
The
wiggle
wiggle.
and try to work in the discipline part with the wiggle part and
I
let it
love it.
all live together.
That's great.
Yes.
That one
I'm
of
so
our
glad you shared that story. That's good.
Can I tell
Yeah.
another quick story? Okay, one of our trainers had 7 children, and she'd already been using another language arts program in her homeschool. And a friend said, "Oh, you should try spell to write and read." And so she started telling her about it. And finally, Britta said, "Okay, I'm going to use it next year temporarily, but I'm not going to do this part, and I'm not going to do that part, and I'm sure not going to do this thing they call fingergrams, where you
Mm.
represent letters with your hands and fingers." And she said, "Okay." Well, she started teaching. Was five of her children were very active tree climbing, fence jumping boys. And the first time she gave a word to her first grader boy, sixth grade boy, they got all the way through it, and he just was turned into drama king and fell out on the floor. Oh, this is awful. I can't stand it. Get up, get back in your chair. Let's do another word. And they went through another word, same thing, fell out on the floor. Can I please go outside? Can I please do this? She did start teaching some of her spelling outside to it. So at least they could be in the fresh air and have their feet on the ground.
Yeah.
But she kept up with it as hard as it was. And after about 3 weeks, some of her sons started saying, Mom, when are we going to do that spelling thing again? Mom, I can't wait till we do it. Is it time? And
Great.
she realized that the logic that she was teaching them, the explicit phonics and the orderly way of looking at one word at a time was getting their attention. And they
Yeah.
were no longer falling out on the floor. They were still the fence climbing, yeah,
Mhm.
tree climbing, fence climbing boys, whatever, but they started learning to love English because of the way mom taught it. And so at the end of that year, she said, I think I'll keep using it. And what would happen if I did all those things I said I would never do? And she did. And she said it wasn't a problem. It just got better. She says SWR is a very forgiving curriculum. Even if
Mhm.
you make
Mm.
mistakes and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
come back later and
Sure.
make changes, it still works.
It's true.
Yes.
Yeah, so they were
Yes.
they were liking the intellectual stimulus.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
You know,
great.
when you said you had a Steve and I have had a Jordan and Andrew. Well, I had a Michael Jordan and Andrew and Sophia. So I have similar story. Somebody gave me a book called The Way They Learn by Cynthia Tobias. And I read it and it was talking about the way students learn and how they process information. And I just remember a significant day that we were doing spelling and I was wanting them to listen. And my middle child kept talking to the older one and my older one is a very bare bones. He was like, I don't want to do all the songs and all that stuff. So spell, write, and read was good because he didn't have all that. And then I had this other one that was like, well, are we going to sing the alphabet or are we going to sing this? So he would talk to his brother when I was dictating. And I said, Jordan, you need to be quiet. And then so eventually I moved him. And then he started talking to his other brother. And I said, you can't sit there either. So I moved him again and he started talking to himself. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with you? So I sent him to his room and I was like, I'm just going to have his dad talk to him. And all of a sudden it was this, I don't know, lightning moment, this providential thing. He is a verbal learner. And I was like, oh my gosh, that totally revolutionized just reading that book and recognizing it in Jordan. And so we began to do different things. We went outside, we jumped on the trampoline and spelled. And sometimes we had to sit down and we had to do other things. But I knew that our learning didn't have to be just in that box and just sitting in at their desk and finding out how they learn. It was such a huge thing for my own schooling and just has shaped a lot of my approach to teaching.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you, ladies. I appreciate your time. This is great. And I will have
Thanks for having us.
we'll put a lot of links down in the show notes for anybody who wants to get more information. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, for hosting this podcast
Thank
for your
you.
listeners. And thanks for asking me and Nikki to be here.
Yeah. It was great. Very fun.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."